everyone, this is Sam Black with Drafting Archetypes, and today I'm going to be discussing my first impressions of Modern Horizons 3 after playing in the Early Access Streamer event yesterday. I played for 13 hours, I trophied my first two drafts, and after that I mostly lost a lot. So I tried a lot of things, I played against a lot of cards, I saw a huge number of cards in play. As I lost stuff, I tried to adapt, and various adaptations had various different failures that I'd like to think that I learned from. So I'm not really coming from a place of feeling like I've solved everything, but a place where I feel like I've kind of learned a lot of the core dynamics of the format and seen some of what works for me and some of what doesn't work. And I have some tentative thoughts on what my next steps would be, but they're not proven to me to work yet, I suppose. So that's kind of the background information on where I'm coming from. In general, I found that trying to play small ball stuff like the +1/+1 equipment that drains for one when you attack, and like general like hit your opponent for one or like get up one card type stuff felt too low impact. Trying to be purely reactive or like draft control decks in general felt pretty difficult without something like the White Sweeper. The White Sweeper was extremely impressive. The white X, make energy and then kill everything that costs X or less for X the amount of energy you spend. That card is good because it scales well and can answer whatever problems you're facing. But in general, it felt like being a Horizon set, there's a lot going on, and the different archetypes are presenting very, very different kinds of threats. You have blue-black with Sneaky Snacker, the 2/1 flyer that comes back when you draw your third card at common, presenting like persistence of evasive threats that like line up really well against a bunch of removal spells. You have energy type stuff generally able to kind of like go wide and present a bunch of different threats. You have the Eldrazi stuff that's making like very large creatures, so red removal mostly isn't very effective against that. So if you're trying to answer things, it's very easy to have your answers kind of line up poorly against a thing that your deck happened to not be prepared for. So my general impression was I wanted to be big proactive. And what I mean by that is like I tried some kind of like small aggro decks, and they had problems with the fact that there are just like some huge creatures they have trouble attacking through, and attacking on the ground through like Eldrazi Scions in the face of 1 mana kill your creature, gain 3 life from the green common fight spell. Stuff like that was very hard to overcome for just like normal like aggressive creatures. And mostly like the proactive green decks are very good at both making kind of like a lot of extra random blockers from the Scions and or getting very large numbers either from Writhing Chrysalis, the red-green uncommon 2/3 reach that makes 2 Scions and grows whenever an Eldrazi dies or you sack a Scion or something like that. It grows a lot. And then also the adapt stuff and the modified stuff ends up leading to some creatures that end up kind of getting out of hand. There's a lot of trample available to the green decks. Also, as I'm going to get to when I look more at commons by colors, the green commons, both mono green commons and the gold green commons, felt appreciably better than the commons of the other colors to me. So I guess I tried playing some like dedicated Eldrazi ramp deck that in hindsight didn't have enough removal and ended up like losing to some good, mostly to Philia, the Corgi rare, the 2/2 flash when it attacks exile, like Flicker Wispa thing. And without removal was really hard to block because it can exile your like creatures that are trying to block it, and it also can generate value by flickering, its controller's stuff. And there were also just some of those, green creatures that get really big really fast, and not having like cheap removal and just having kind of like mana into big stuff felt like it wasn't quite there in terms of being able to like stabilize early enough. Whereas if in all of my draws I'd had like one efficient removal spell to kill like a problematic creature, then the deck would have been a lot better. So my takeaway after that draft was, oh, I need to like play a bunch of removal. There's good card advantage in blue. I'll try playing like a blue like card advantage and removal type deck. And that's where I found that my cards could line up awkwardly. I played against a Sylvan Safekeeper, which just like blanked all of my removal. Yeah, my takeaway was removal matters, but I want to be proactive and have like some support removal rather than like a whole deck around, removal and trying to just like pair that with card advantage. Getting into like impressions of commons by color. None of the white commons really stood out to me. Looking at this like list of cards in the set, Area Auxiliary, the 3/3 flyer for 4 with bolster or support or whatever 2, seemed like it was probably the best, but it never did anything super impressive in my games. I guess there was like one game that I lost where it gave me some +1/+1 counters that I later proliferated with the 3/1 that proliferates when you play a creature or when a creature enters the battlefield under your control. That kind of like did some nice stuff, but it wasn't able to go over the like red-green big stuff. For the most part, white has, some like okay aggressive creatures and removal, but it mostly seems to just like not scale as well as the green stuff. Blue, Aether Spike, the 2 mana get 2 energy and then counter unless they pay X, felt pretty good, but it was notably very awkward against Eldrazi spawns, where they're, like, if you want to make sure that you counter their spell, you have to spend extra energy for every spawn they have, even though, like, spending a spawn to pay is kind of different than tapping a land, but you still have to, like, so it just makes, like, using Aether Spike to counter stuff against spawns pretty difficult. And then Tune the Narrative, the blue cantrip that makes 2 energy. It's a really good card in an energy deck, but I don't think that I want to be taking it until I like already have a very good reason to care about energy. I think it's not a reason to go energy. Just like, oh, I'll make some energy and maybe that'll do something. Unfathomable Truths, the 5 mana instant that draws 3 and makes an Eldrazi spawn, seemed pretty good. Like there were games where my opponent and I were kind of stable and they played that and it was like, oh, this is terrible for me, especially if like I, because it's an instant, they can pass with 5 mana up, and if I think they have like a counter spell or something and I slow play my hand a little bit and then they draw 3 cards instead, it felt really hard to come back from that. But also because I think, proactive decks are strongest, taking 5 mana off to draw cards can definitely be difficult. So it's kind of like situationally strong. I don't know if it's going to end up being like a really high performing card or not, just because it's going to be, hit or miss. There are going to be some games where it really shines and some games where you can't afford to cast it. In black, Refurbished Familiar, the 4 mana 2/1 flyer with affinity and makes your opponent discard a card when it enters, and if they can't, you draw a card, felt very strong, although affinity felt relatively difficult in this format. It's no Modern Horizons 2 where there are artifact lands. You have to actually like put artifacts into play for your affinity, and affinity is like a pretty narrow theme in the set. It's not like there are artifacts all over the place. So I mostly felt like you should expect to like in the decks that are trying to do it, still plan to spend like 3 mana for it on average. but like 3 mana for it was a fine rate. And then Breathe Your Last, the black removal spell, felt like the best black common probably. That's 1 BB, destroy target creature, maybe also Planeswalker. Doesn't matter very much in the set. And gain 1 life for each of its colors, which doesn't work against Devoid stuff, but hard removal felt very valuable. Wither and Bloom was also good, but I think Breathe Your Last is better, although black can be, notably awkward, especially since, as I'll get to, I think that this is a format with a lot of splashing. Red, Galvanic Discharge, that's the lightning bolt-ish. Instant make 3 energy, then spend X energy, deal X damage to a creature. Felt really good. Both killing little stuff and underpaying energy and netting energy from it's very good. And also, there would be some games where I'd make a whole bunch of energy and then I could like use it to kill a huge creature, which isn't necessarily easy for Red to do. I think Galvanic Discharge is like appreciably better than the Replicate 3 damage uncommon because it costs 1 less mana and it's an instant. And like if you have like the Replicate one can kill multiple creatures, but Aether Spike is at least as good at killing big creatures. Like they're both 3 damage base and then 3 extra energy for 3 more damage, except Discharge can spend exactly the right increment. So it's better at killing a single big creature, but worse at killing like a bunch of 3/3s or whatever. But overall, I think it's a much stronger card. And then Fanged Flame is the 4 damage exile. The thing it damages, sorcery. Seemed like it was probably the next best red common, which I mostly see as damning the other red commons with Faint Praise or something. Well, not exactly faint. I mean, I'm not really praised. Basically, the red commons mostly seemed unimpressive. I'd say, you can, like, the thing is, Fanged Flames isn't a card I'm super excited about in any deck, and I think that, like, in most decks, there will be some red common that I want over it, but there was no red common that was kind of, like, multi-purpose enough that I think it's a stronger card or a card that I would take over Fanged Flames early. With all of those colors seeming kind of underwhelming to me, green seemed like the best by a lot. Horrific Assault, the 1 mana creature deals damage equal to its power. If the creature that did that was Neldrazi and kills the thing, you gain 3 life, was great. Nyxborn Hydra was very good. If you have any kind of like +1/+1 counter synergies or modified synergies, they could actually like do pretty good stuff early, and then late it represents like a lot of extra damage with trample. It also has reach for defense, and like if you put it on a creature to get a reach blocker, then like a single removal spell generally doesn't get rid of having a reach blocker. So the Hydra, that's the green X reach trample XX with bestow for green X that then gives XX reach and trample to the creature it's bestowed upon. Nightshade Dryad, 1 and a green for a 1/2 death touch, tap for a colorless or mana of any color. Seemed very strong. Lets you kill anything with Horrific Assault, gives you colorless for your colorless symbols, also any color for any of your splashes, also blocks like these giant creatures pretty well. Evolution Witness seems like a very strong card to me. It's honestly not as impressive as the other stuff, but like having it at common, this is the 3 mana 1/2 with adapt to that returns permanent from your graveyard to your hand when it gets a +1/+1 counter on it. Having it at common means you can get like a couple of them returning each other. Also, there are a bunch of other ways to put counters on it to like get things back more later. The fact that it wasn't that impressive really speaks to how much I think the format is like more explosive than grindy, but it still seems like a pretty strong card to me. And then similarly along kind of the same axis, Temperamental Oozewag, the 4 mana 4/4 with adapt that gives all of your modified creatures trample, which seems kind of, like one of those generic numbers green commons that I'd expect to kind of only be mediocre. like, because the creatures end up being so big and, you know, being proactive seems to be what's going on. Like making your big guys have trample is huge, especially with all the spawns around. So Oozwag kind of overperformed for me. So green overall felt very deep. I didn't even like mention every green common that, like, there are a bunch of other green commons that seem solid. And then in multicolor, like I've said, I think Writhing Chrysalis, the red-green devoid Eldrazi, is the best common in the set. I think it's like appreciably ahead of the others. Expanding Ooze, the green-black 3/3 with Adapt that puts a counter on a modified creature when it attacked, seems pretty good. The others had their moments. They weren't like game-defining by default the way that the Chrysalis was. None of them seemed bad. All of them seemed like pretty good when you build around them, but it was more just like, oh, that's like, you know, a good common for your deck. Whereas Chrysalis was more like, it just didn't feel like playing against a common. As for the lands, I would say the landscapes played at least as well as I anticipated they would. They didn't feel like they made my draws very clunky, since they come into play untapped and also can get you a colored source right away. If your mana is really complicated, the fact that you have to choose a single color for them to give you can make it difficult, but that's more a function of like having a really ambitious mana base and less a function of the land itself not being powerful or being clunky. The cycling abilities, so it has been officially confirmed that those abilities are put on the cards for legibility, and it's huge. Being able to just like look at the 3 colored symbols at the bottom of the card to tell you what kind of mana you get from the card is absolutely necessary to make them parsable in a draft. But the cycling ability comes up a little bit, but isn't very important. And I was generally pretty picky about choosing, like, I was prioritizing them very, very highly when I was using all of their colors, and less highly, like not very highly, if I was only using 2 of the colors. And I think that moving forward, I might prioritize them even more highly, especially early in the draft. I found that splashing with these things was very easy. I played my most successful, those first drafts that I had that were my most successful, one was like solid 5 color and the other was 2 color with 2 splashes. In general, splashing felt extremely easy. I didn't really feel punished for it, and I was taking lands highly, and if anything, I'm inclined to take them more highly rather than less highly moving forward. The same is true of the uncommon DFCs. I was taking the dual lands, the ones that enter tapped always, mostly just because I wanted dual lands and I didn't necessarily anticipate using the spell side of them very much. And mostly I was really impressed by how good the spells were on some where the spells seemed like not that great or really situational. I was most impressed by Suppression Ray and Blood-Soaked Insight. So Suppression Ray is the blue-white 5-mana sorcery that taps all your opponent's creatures, and then you can spend energy to put stun counters on them. I was playing that without any energy, but it was very common that tapping all of my opponent's creatures would result in my opponent being dead. And Blood-Soaked Insight, I kind of didn't think it would be easy to cast it for not very much mana, and didn't know how good like spend a bunch of mana, exile the top 3 cards would be. In practice, it was surprisingly common to cast it for 2 mana, and I once paid 7 mana for it, and it was still great. I think that I got a little above average lucky on hitting cards from my opponent. I was usually able to like exactly use all of my mana to use every card they gave me, but those cards both really, really overperformed. And I was thinking about it further, and I realized that the set just doesn't have a lot of mana sinks. It has expensive spells, and it has some like equipment and some bestow and some adapt, but that's all just kind of like one-time costs. And a lot of the kinds of cards that exist in sets that would often have activated abilities with a mana cost input in this set have an energy input instead. And so, certainly compared to a lot of recent sets, it's been really easy to just not have stuff to spend mana on in the mid to late game. And so, because of that, I really want to prioritize the DFCs, and my plan for them in almost all cases is to run them like 1-to-1 as direct land replacements. Like, just treat every DFC as a land, because I mean, these DFCs are much better as lands than the previous land DFCs that we've had, since they tap for 2 colors or have the ability to enter untapped. And so I'm pretty comfortable. And then also the fact that the common lands don't enter tapped makes the uncommon lands enter tapped much less punishing, especially with like the gold ones, or the gold ones, where they always enter tapped. But then your mana is pretty good, so you're less likely to need to sack your common lands to find a basic to cast your spells after you play like the tapped DFC. So, like, sequencing your lands such that having a bunch of non-basic lands wasn't very punishing seemed relatively easy. And then, because it's relatively easy to flood out because of the dearth of mana sinks, having the ability to cast your lands as spells seems especially important. So, like I said, my plan to start is to prioritize the MDFCs highly, and if I have like 4 or more of them, I might, play an 18th land, figuring it's going to be hard to flood. I can cast like several of these as spells. But the first 3 or more, I would usually just replace the land for, unless my deck has a reason to want a particularly high land count. And even then, it's more like, oh, I'm going to play 18 lands, but these things are going to replace some of the lands. I also would try pretty hard in general not to go to 16 lands in this set, and instead to just try to prioritize MDFCs more highly. But, if you can't do that and you have like a low curve deck, I think it's certainly reasonable to simply play fewer lands. As far as linearity goes, like how much the set is just like draft, find a lane, draft a theme. I'd say while I was drafting, I mostly felt pulled in multiple directions within a single color, and it was hard to find a lane where, oh, all of my picks are just energy cards, and this is clearly what I'm doing, especially with energy within only 2 colors. I think that there will obviously be drafts where you happen to be the only person on a particular theme and you have a great deck that's just all in on that thing. But I don't think that you should expect that the average deck is like super all in on a theme. And I don't think that you should really like try to be or stress out about it if you can't find a narrow lane. I think it's going to be pretty common for decks to have like 2 reasonably deeply supported themes, or not really worry too much about any of the specific themes and just have a bunch of good cards. So while there are narrow lanes present, my first impression is that this isn't like super linear in terms of like a really strong push to follow those themes in most cases. So to start with, for me, I'll be prioritizing like raw power, fixing, efficient removal, and then trying to do all of that in a proactive way, focusing more on getting, numbers, power, and toughness on the battlefield more than I focus on getting additional cards in my hand, while trying to be cognizant of the difficulty in reliably having ways to spend mana in the mid to late game, but where the best way to handle that issue is just to kill your opponent before you run out of stuff to spend mana on. So there you have it. Those are kind of my takeaways from my successful and unsuccessful runs in my early drafts. And now I'm going to turn it over to chat for questions. As always, I want to start by thanking the newest patrons. So thank you very much, Chris and Jonathan. If anyone else is interested in supporting the podcast, be sure to check out patreon.com/draftingarchetypes for further details. So getting into questions, do I feel the set is more complicated than MH2? No, but I played a relatively limited amount of MH2, but I don't. I think that they're comparable, not radically different, I guess. How good did removal feel in this set? I'd say removal felt very necessary. Unfortunately, it didn't always feel good. Like, it didn't seem difficult for a removal spell to line up awkwardly. But I did feel like after playing, I wanted to prioritize removal more highly than I was originally inclined to. Did I ever struggle to balance the number of basics and the common tri-lands? I think there might have been one time when there was one time when I started with 41 cards to have room for an extra basic because I was like solid 5 color, and then I realized that I should just not be playing Null Elemental Blast, and I just played like an extra land and one less card, and I had a bunch of MDFCs and it was fine. I would say most of the time it was not really an issue. Did I feel like there was a big difference between the power level of commons/uncommons versus rares and mythics? Yes. There's a phrase that gets tossed around a lot, mythic uncommons, to refer to the top few uncommons in a set that kind of play like rares. I think that Writhing Chrysalis felt like a mythic common, and there were a few other like commons and uncommons where, you know, there'd be games where it's like, wow, that's not a rare, okay. Especially among the Eldrazi Scion type stuff. Like the red-green uncommon that puts a +1/+1 counter on all of your Eldrazi when it enters or attacks often felt kind of like a rare. But overall, I would certainly say the commons in aggregate definitely felt appreciably weaker than the higher rarity cards. Weaker and or more narrow and linear, but also like the, you know, scale of impact along a linear path for the uncommon. Like a narrow uncommon, the output would be much higher than the output for a narrow common. So yeah, yes, the more rare cards were more powerful in a way that I think was noticeable. Sounds like the format could be a bit more mid-range than we've seen lately. Maybe. I'm a little bit concerned that it might end up being kind of like more aggressive because of how difficult reacting to things felt, but it's hard for me to say with confidence at this point. Did I get a good feel for the speed of the format? Are control/grindy decks viable? My first impression was that they were difficult without appropriate rares. There are some rares, again, most notably the Wrath, but not just that make playing defensive strategies more viable. But like in general, my primary impression with trying to play answer-heavy decks was that there were a lot of ways for answers to line up poorly. Do I think my drafting style might have led to less linear decks? I mostly saw linear decks through though often 3 colors from other streamers. Maybe. I mean, I definitely felt like... I started with a draft where I opened to like a 3-color mythic into a 4-color mythic, as my first 2 picks of the draft. And then I was just prioritizing fixing and strong cards, and that worked really well. And then after that, I saw like some opponents do some linear stuff that looked good, and when I tried doing linear stuff, it mostly didn't work as well. I don't know if that's due to the way that I'm inclined to play linear decks not lining up properly. Like if I just had like went about doing it wrong. Uh, I struggled some with some of the linear stuff, and I succeeded with the less linear stuff. But I also think that my like strengths in drafting and things that generally work for me are more in the like multicolor, independently powerful cards kind of space. So very low confidence on um, you know, exactly how much to read into like one day of one person drafting here. Like, the sample sizes are both small and very heavily biased by just being my experience. So I certainly am not looking to say none of the linears work. Ignore every, artifact and all of the energy stuff and you're never going to modify a creature like that. That's certainly not what I'm saying. I have a tendency to go kind of extreme, like either don't do a linear thing at all, or if I'm going to do a linear thing, like go all in on it and like only have removal that like specifically synergizes with the creatures and stuff. And I don't think that's the right way to do it. I think that all of the decks need to prioritize removal and going really deep on some of the like more narrow, more all-in linear stuff early, and just kind of like making sure that stuff actually works isn't how I would approach it again moving forward. So I'd say like linear, but with like a slightly lighter touch might be more effective. Did I encounter any aggressive commons that play well in multiples? Writhing Chrysalis in particular stood out as a common that plays extremely well in multiples because additional ones make additional spawns, and then when you sack any of the spawns, all of the chrysalises grow. Also, it's mostly at the uncommon level with green black with the adapt stuff, but multiple of the green black uncommon that puts extra counters on stuff when they get counters goes pretty crazy. I suppose there were 1 or 2 games where multiple of the red black equipment played well together. So I would say like yes, a lot of the like the linear payoff, like the common signpost stuff mostly plays pretty well in multiples. So yes, like finding an open color pair where you can get a bunch of the gold cards in that color pair is like certainly a thing that you will be rewarded for. Do I think there's any hope for a successful Tamiyo meets the Story Circle deck? And if so, how do you think it might come together? So there's some hope, I guess, but it felt really difficult. It's hard to so you can loop it with another copy of itself or with Evolution Witness, but like green blue is not really about anything that is happening there. So you're looking at like a multicolor deck or just like getting multiple of them. And like I said, trying to play like super hard control felt really, really difficult. It would be nice to play it with like the Wrath and stuff, and like I haven't given up on trying to find a way to play the control decks, even if it has seemed difficult. I think that my like first attempts were like in blue red, where I could struggle with like really big creatures, and it might work better in Esper, where you have like the kicker, exile a creature, sorcery, and white, and the Breathe Your Last in black to pair it with. I mean, Tamiyo Meets the Story Circle, I guess, just like structurally makes the most sense in like the blue-black draw extras deck. And if you find the right removal there, I could see it. But like playing against the different decks, I would say that like blue-black wasn't by default the scariest thing I was playing against. But again, I'm very much not trying to like write off any color combinations at this point or anything. Just speaking to like what seemed harder to get together from my limited experience. Did the cycling on the lands come into play often? No, very rarely, and it doesn't matter very much. Does this help support a 5-color goods? Definitely not at all. The cycling part doesn't, but the lands being great does. I have a question that's a little out of scope that I usually wouldn't address, but it's like a little bit interesting to talk about briefly, I think. The question is, would I think that someone who's not been drafting for a long time should take the time to play a set such as this in order to get better? What's the main difference with a standard set? So the reason I wouldn't address this usually is what should I do is never really a question I like to try to answer for other people. I have no idea for any given person what their cost-benefit analysis looks like, what they're comparing it to, what they're going to be like satisfied or frustrated by, any of a million different things that would make deciding how to spend one's time a very unique and personal decision. But to speak to just kind of like how this compares to other sets, I honestly don't think it's all that different from normal sets these days, now that the normal sets have so many different things going on with different bonus sheets and stuff like that. There are, more different mechanics and less like narrative, but the like linearity of archetypes is pretty similar, and the overall complexity, while potentially a little bit higher, I think is pretty comparable personally. As far as, drafting whatever you have available to draft is going to make you a better drafter. If you haven't been drafting, I don't know how much you care about that. But overall, I would say that, I'm struggling to come up with like what I would consider very significant ways in which I think that this set is an appreciably different experience in terms of like complexity or power band or like direction or whatever than like OTJ, and it feels pretty similar to me from what I've experienced so far. Did I get a good feeling for White's identity? It's stated to support both energy and modified. Does it seem to do either well? So there is overlap in supporting these. Like some of the energy stuff leads to modifications. Like the Slith gives you energy, and then the energy can help get it through, and then when it gets through, it gets a counter. And there's like the common that makes a servo or a counter or 3 energy that like, a single slot that plays reasonably in any of the directions. There's it's not just in white, but the blue-white uncommon that gets energy and then can spend energy to put exalted counters on things leads to like modified. So there is like overlap there, and then also proliferates when that comes up works both. Like any proliferate gives you an energy and then also increases all of your other counters. So there is overlap there. The white cards, like the white commons to me mostly seem individually pretty weak. Some of the bestow stuff played pretty well. My impression right now is that white mostly feels aggressive, but in a way that's just so much less scary to play against than the way that green is aggressive. But it has some amount, like it's the evasion kind of gives it a different character and some of the resilience, I guess, from like the bestow stuff. But I think like because of reach appearing on some of green's best commons and the significance of trample in the set and like the availability of trample on powerful green commons, like trample being a better version of a better form of evasion in most cases than reach, than flying, made what white is offering feel a little bit less compelling than it might otherwise be. So my initial impression of white is that it's like outclassed aggressive, but I could see the modified stuff scaling pretty well. There were some games where like, you know, the draws came together well and it did impressive stuff. Some of the bestow stuff was like pretty hard to deal with. But it didn't impress me in its first outing, I'd say. DeFore said this is one of the most aggressive formats he's ever played. Would I agree that it's super aggressively slanted? That was certainly my impression. Like, honestly, I have concerns for my long-term enjoyment of the set in that I'm afraid of how many parallels there are between this and Phyrexia All Will Be One, which also featured powerful red and green decks that involved huge creatures that other colors had trouble lining up against, with multiple playable effects that invalidated all blockers, and like generally aggressive synergy focused directions available to other colors that like mostly wanted to be aggressive and felt potentially outclassed by the bigger numbers on red and green. Like there, and also the lack of mana sinks. So there are a distressing number of possible parallels to Phyrexia All Will Be One. The like big Eldrazi is not analogous to a component of Phyrexia All Will Be One. And you know, it's certainly too easy to see how it's going to like really play out. The fixing is very different. The multicolor aspect is different. But there's certainly, you know, room for a lot of features of Phyrexia All Will Be One to play out here. All right. I'm going to wrap it up there. So thanks everyone who tuned in yesterday, and thanks everyone who tuned in today for tuning in and for the questions. Really appreciate it. Have fun and good luck at the pre-release, everyone. And I will be back with more MH3 gameplay on Tuesday tomorrow. And I believe I'll be trying to record the first archetype breakdown on Wednesday next week as usual. So again, have a good weekend, and I will see you then. Bye for now.
Prepare for light speed.